The stars above Keth 7 burned cold and distant, scattered like broken glass across a sky that never truly went dark. And somewhere beneath that sky, in the dust and the silence of a dying moon, the deadliest hunter the galaxy had ever produced was watching a human walk alone. Syrath Kale did not blink, because her species had no need for blinking, and she did not breathe loudly, because her species had learned 10,000 years ago that silence was the first weapon a predator ever needed. And she crouched on a ridge of black volcanic rock, 300 meters above the colony called Ashfall Station, and she studied her prey the way a surgeon studies a body before cutting it open. She was 8 feet tall when she stood straight, though she rarely stood straight, because height was a disadvantage when you were trying to kill something, and her body was covered in overlapping plates of natural chitin that had the color of burnt copper and the hardness of military-grade ceramic, and from each forearm extended a retractable blade of sharpened bone that could slide through steel plating if she put enough force behind it, and she always put enough force behind it. She was Veirathi, and the Veirathi had been hunting sentient species across 40 star systems for longer than most civilizations had existed. And among the Veirathi, she was not just any hunter. She was Neshvora, a title that translated roughly into the common galactic tongue as she who has never lost prey. And in 11 years of sanctioned hunts, she had killed over 300 sentient beings from 19 different species, and not one of them had ever survived past the 3rd night. Tonight was the 1st night. The Veirathi Dominion had added humans to the prey registry 6 cycles ago, after the soft little creatures had started expanding into Veirathi-claimed space without permission. And the matriarchs had decided it was time to remind the galaxy who sat at the top of the pile. Food chain. And so they had chosen Syrath, because Syrath was the best, and the best deserved the honor of being first. She had spent 3 days in orbit, studying the colony below, listening to their communications, learning their language, mapping their routines, and she had selected her target with the patience and precision that had made her legendary. His name was Eli Morrow. He was a sergeant in something the humans called the Colonial Marines, and he was 34 years old, and he had scars on his face and hands that told her he has seen violence before, and he moved differently from the other humans in the colony, not with the lazy carelessness of civilians, but with the quiet, controlled awareness of something that understood what it meant to be in danger. He was the only one down there who walked like a predator, and Syrath always chose the most dangerous target available, because killing the weak proved nothing. Communication relay 2 hours ago, with a focused electromagnetic pulse from her ship. And the humans would think it was equipment malfunction, because humans always looked for comfortable explanations before they considered terrifying ones. And by the time they realized what had actually happened, it would be far too late for Eli Morrow. She descended from the ridge in silence, her clawed feet finding purchase on the volcanic rock, with the ease of a creature born to climb and kill. And the gravity on Keth 7 was lighter than her homeworld, which made her faster and stronger than usual. And she felt the familiar warmth of anticipation spreading through her chest, the ancient biological reward her species received before a kill, the feeling the Veirathi poets called the Song of the Hunt. Eli Morrow was on a perimeter check. He walked the eastern edge of the colony alone, because the colony was small and understaffed, and there was never anything out there except dust and rock, and the occasional seismic tremor from the moon's unstable core, and he carried a standard-issue sidearm on his hip and a flashlight in his left hand, and he was thinking about the coffee waiting for him back at the barracks when the first blade came out of the darkness. It missed his throat by less than an inch. He felt the air split beside his neck, and heard the whisper of something sharp, moving faster than anything that size should have been able to move. and before his brain had fully processed what was happening, his body was already reacting, dropping low, rolling left, putting distance between himself and the source of the attack. Something warm ran down the side of his neck, and he touched it, and his fingers came back red. And he realized the blade had not missed entirely. It had opened a shallow cut from just below his ear to the edge of his jaw, and if he had been standing 1 inch to the right, he would already be dead. Darkness with his flashlight, and saw nothing, and the dust around him was undisturbed, as if whatever had attacked him weighed nothing at all, or knew exactly where to place its feet to leave no trace. His radio was dead, and he realized with a cold clarity that this was not a coincidence, that the comm relay going down and this attack were connected, and that meant someone or something had planned this, had studied the colony, had chosen this moment and this place, and probably had chosen him specifically. Most people would have run. Running was the logical response, the survival response, the response that evolution had spent millions of years programming into the genes of every creature that had ever lived on any world in any system, and Eli Morrow knew this because he was not stupid. But Eli Morrow did not run. He turned off his flashlight because the light made him a target, and he holstered his sidearm because a gun was useless against something he could not see. And he stood very still in the darkness and listened with every nerve in his body. And then he did something that made Syrath pause on her perch, 60 meters away, and tilt her head in a way that her species only did when they encountered something they did not understand. He turned around and walked toward where the strike had come from. Not fast, not panicked, not with the desperate charge of a cornered animal, but with the slow, deliberate steps of a man who had decided that whatever was out there in the dark was going to have to face him, whether it wanted to or not. Syrath watched him come, and she felt the song of the hunt falter for just a moment, just a heartbeat, because in 300 kills across 19 species, she had never once seen prey move toward the predator. She shook it off, because she was Neshvora, and doubt was not something she allowed herself, and she repositioned for a second strike, and the first night of the hunt stretched out ahead of them, both like a promise and a threat. The human was bleeding and alone, and outmatched in every way that mattered. But he was walking forward, and somewhere deep in a part of her brain she did not like to acknowledge, Sirath Kale felt the smallest cold flicker of something she could not name. Sirath had studied humans before she came to Keth 7, and the file the Dominion kept on them was not impressive, and it described a species that was soft and slow and fragile, a species with no natural armor and no claws and no venom and no biological weapons of any kind, a species that bruised easily and bled freely and broke apart under pressures that most galactic predators would barely notice. The file classified them as Class 12 Deathworlders, which meant their homeworld was dangerous by galactic standards. But the Veyrathi homeworld was Class 15, and that meant the Veyrathi were harder and tougher and more lethal in every measurable way. And Sirath had read the human file the way an apex predator reads about a small animal, with mild curiosity and absolute confidence. That confidence was starting to develop cracks. The human was not behaving the way prey was supposed to behave, and Sirath knew this because she had hunted 19 species and every single one of them followed the same basic pattern when they realized they were being hunted, and that pattern started with fear and moved through panic and ended with either desperate flight or desperate pleading, and the human was doing neither of these things. The human was tracking her. She had repositioned to a cluster of volcanic rock formations east of the colony perimeter, moving in complete silence across terrain that would have been impassable for most species, and she had settled into a hunting blind between two tall stones and prepared for her second strike. And then she had detected movement in the dust field below her, and realized that Eli Morrow was not running away from her. He was following her trail. He moved slowly and carefully with his flashlight off and his body low to the ground, and he stopped every few meters to study the dirt and the rock, and Sirath realized with a jolt of something between surprise and irritation that he was reading her tracks. Almost invisible, marks her clawed feet left on the volcanic stone. Marks that most species would never have noticed. She struck from above, dropping from the rock formation with her bone blades extended, and she was fast. Faster than anything his size should have been able to react to. And she hit him across the ribs with a sweeping cut that opened a gash from his hip to his chest. And the smell of human blood filled the air, hot and rich and alien. He should have gone down, and most things would have gone down. But instead he twisted with the impact and brought his arm up, and she felt something hard connect with the side of her head. And she realized he had been holding a rock the size of his fist, and the blow cracked one of the smaller chitin plates above her left eye. She disengaged and repositioned, because that was what her training demanded. Reassess after unexpected resistance, and she watched from 30 meters away as the human dropped to one knee and pressed his hand against the wound on his ribs, and the blood ran between his fingers and soaked into the dust. Then he did something that made her biosensors spike with readings she had never recorded before. He pulled a mining flare from his belt, one of the chemical emergency flares the colonists used in the mines, and he cracked it open, and the tip blazed white-hot, and he pressed it against the wound on his ribs. The sound he made was not a scream exactly. It was something deeper and more controlled, a sound forced through clenched teeth and bitten leather. And the smell of burning human flesh mixed with the copper smell of blood, and Sirath watched through her enhanced vision as the wound sealed shut under the heat, ugly and brutal and effective. He cauterized his own wound with a tool that burned at over 1,000 degrees, and he did it without hesitation and without stopping, and without making any sound louder than that controlled grinding noise between his teeth. Sirath ran a biological scan on him from her position, and the results confused her, because his heart rate was not climbing the way a prey animal's heart rate should climb when it was wounded and afraid. His heart rate was actually decreasing, dropping into a slow, steady rhythm that her database associated not with fear, but with focused concentration. His body was flooded with chemicals her scanner identified as adrenaline and cortisol and norepinephrine, a cocktail that in most species produced blind panic. But in this human it seemed to produce the opposite, a cold, sharp clarity that narrowed his focus and steadied his hands, and turned his eyes into something that looked less like prey and more like something she did not want to name. She struck again 20 minutes later, coming from a different angle, and her blade caught his left shoulder and punched through the muscle and scraped against the bone beneath, and the human grunted and staggered, and blood poured down his arm, and she pulled back for the killing strike. He caught her blade arm, not with a weapon, not with a tool, but with his bare hand, his fingers wrapping around the bone blade that was still wet with his own blood, and the edges cut into his palm and his fingers, and his blood ran down her arm, and he held on with a grip that should not have been possible for something with so little muscle mass. She tore free because she was stronger than him, much stronger, but the delay cost her the killing strike, and he stumbled backward into the darkness of the rock field and disappeared. Sirath pursued because she always pursued, and the hunt wound deeper into the volcanic landscape of Ket 7, through narrow canyons and across fields of sharp black stone, and past the openings of abandoned mine shafts that led down into the guts of the moon. She was faster than him, and she was stronger than him, and she could see in the dark, and he could not. Of predation. This should have been over hours ago, and yet the human kept moving, kept bleeding, kept refusing to fall down and stay down. She found him again, near the entrance to an old mine shaft, and she came in fast and silent and perfect, and the ground beneath her exploded. He had rigged a mining charge, one of the small controlled blast devices the colonists used to break rock, and he had buried it under a thin layer of dust and he had waited near it like bait, and when she crossed the trigger point, the blast threw a ton of volcanic rock into the air and brought it down on top of her. The rockfall pinned her left leg and cracked two of her main chitin plates along her torso, and for a moment she could not move, and she felt something wet and warm running down her side, and she looked down and saw that the liquid was green and glowing faintly in the darkness. It was her blood. Sirath had not bled in 11 years of hunting, not once. 300 kills she had made across 19 species, and she stared at the blood on her claws and on the rock, and felt the world shift beneath her in a way that had nothing to do with the unstable ground of Keth 7. She pulled herself free because she was Veyrathi, and the Veyrathi did not stay trapped, and she stood on her damaged leg and tested her weight and felt the pain lance up through her body. And pain was something she understood. Pain was familiar. Pain was manageable. But the emotion beneath the pain was not familiar and was not manageable. She looked out into the darkness where the human had disappeared, bleeding from 3 wounds that should have killed him, walking on legs that should have collapsed, driven by something her species had no biological framework to understand. And Sirath Kale, the Neshvora, she who has never lost prey, the deadliest huntress the Veyrathi Dominion had produced in 6,000 years, stood alone in the dark and felt something her people considered a myth, something their warriors told stories about to frighten children, something that no living Veyrathi had ever actually experienced. She felt doubt. Dawn came to Keth 7 the way it always did, slow and red and angry, the distant sun dragging itself above the horizon, like it resented having to light this miserable little moon at all. And the volcanic dust caught the light and turned the air the color of old blood. And somewhere in that red morning, Sirath Kale realized she had made a mistake. She had assumed the human would use the night to hide, to rest, to tend his wounds and find shelter, and wait for rescue that would never come, because she had destroyed the communication relay. And she had used the hours after the mineshaft explosion to tend her own injuries, pulling rock fragments from between her chitin plates, letting her natural healing factor begin to close the cracks in her armor, testing her damaged leg until she was satisfied it would hold in combat. She had settled into a sheltered position in a canyon 2 kilometers from the mineshaft, and she had allowed herself 4 hours of restorative stillness. Was not sleep exactly, but something close to it, a state where her body focused all its energy on repair, while her senses remained partially active. When she emerged from the canyon into the red dawn, she expected to have to track the human, to find where he had crawled off to die or hide, to follow his blood trail, to whatever hole he had stuffed himself into. Instead, she found him 200 meters away, walking toward her. He looked terrible, and that was being generous, because his left arm hung at an angle that suggested something inside it was no longer connected the way it should be. And the cauterized wound on his ribs had cracked open and was leaking fresh blood through the burned edges. And his face was the color of old paper, and his lips were dry and cracked, and his eyes were ringed with dark circles that made him look like something that had already died and simply forgotten to stop moving. But he was walking, and he was walking toward her. Good Hand was holding a blade he had fashioned from a broken mining pick, the handle wrapped in strips of torn fabric, and Sirath could see from the way he held it that he had made it specifically to fit between the gaps in Veyrathi chitin plating. He had studied the fragments of her armor left behind at the mineshaft, and he had identified the weak points, and he had built a weapon designed to exploit them. And he had done all of this while bleeding from 3 wounds that should have killed him, in the dark, on a moon where the temperature had dropped below freezing overnight. Sirath felt a sensation she had no name for, and decided to deal with it by attacking. She was a burst predator, which meant her species had evolved for short, explosive engagements, overwhelming force delivered in seconds, and she closed the distance between them in 3 strides, and struck with both bone blades in a crossing pattern that should have opened him from hip to shoulder. He did not try to block, because he was not stupid enough to think he could match her strength. And instead, he threw himself sideways, and rolled, and came up with the mining pick blade extended. And the tip caught her across the forearm, and slid into the gap between two chitin plates, and opened a wound that made her hiss with pain and surprise. She disengaged, because that was what burst predators did. Strike, and withdraw, and strike again. And she put 50 meters between them, and waited for her breathing to slow, and her muscles to recover, because the explosive effort of a full attack drained her quickly, and she needed time between engagements. And the human did not wait. He followed, not running, not charging, just walking, steady and relentless, one foot in front of the other, bleeding and broken, and absolutely refusing to stop. Sirith attacked again 30 minutes later, and she wounded him again, a deep cut across his thigh that should have dropped him. And she withdrew again to recover, and he kept walking. She attacked a third time an hour after that, and this time he was ready, and her blade found his forearm, but his mining pick found the cracked plates on her torso and drove into the soft tissue beneath. And she screamed, a sound the Verathi made only when genuinely hurt, and she retreated further this time, 1/2 kilometer. And she crouched behind a rock formation and breathed hard, and felt her body struggling to keep up with the damage. And this human kept walking. That was when Sirath finally understood what she was dealing with, and the understanding hit her like a physical blow. She was a burst predator, and he was something else entirely. Something her species had no equivalent for. Something the galactic record called persistence predation. And it meant that he did not need to be faster than her, and he did not need to be stronger than her, and he did not need to win any single engagement. Needed to not stop. He just needed to keep coming. He just needed to outlast her, and every time she attacked and withdrew to recover, he was still there, still moving, still closing the distance. And she was getting tired and he was not, because his body was built for this, built to walk and walk and walk until the thing in front of him could not walk anymore. She contacted her ship for the first time in any hunt. Not for extraction, because the Neshvora did not request extraction, but to access the Dominion's xenobiology archive. And she pulled the file on humans and read it again with new eyes. Class 12 Death World, the file said, and endurance adapted, and primitive, and no threat rating. She wanted to reach through the screen and tear apart whoever had written those words, because they were the most dangerously incorrect words she had ever read. She queried the archive for more detail on human endurance, and the results made her blood chill in a way that the freezing temperature of Kef 7 had not managed. Humans could maintain sustained activity for days without sleep, the file said, and their bodies produced internal chemicals that suppressed pain and fatigue, and allowed them to continue functioning well past the point where their muscles and organs should have failed. And their species had evolved on a world where they had hunted prey by simply following it at a walking pace until it collapsed from exhaustion, sometimes over distances of 50 or 60 kilometers, and they had done this for millions of years before they ever invented weapons. They were not fast, and they were not strong, and they were not armored, and they were not venomous. They were the thing that followed you forever. Sirath closed the file and looked out across the dust field and saw him, a small figure in the red light of the dying day, still walking, still coming, and she felt the doubt from the night before grow into something larger and heavier and harder to ignore. She moved, because staying still was death against a persistent predator, and she moved fast, putting distance between them, circling around to the north, trying to regain the advantage, trying to find a position where she could end this with one perfect strike. But when she stopped to rest and assess, she looked at the terrain around her and felt something cold settle into her stomach. The abandoned mine complex was behind her, She had been moving north without thinking about it, reacting to his pressure, retreating along the path of least resistance. And he had been hurting her, gently and patiently, and with a strategic awareness that had nothing to do with instinct and everything to do with intelligence. She was no longer the hunter. She looked back toward the distant figure, still walking toward her, and realized with a horror that went deeper than anything physical that she had not been the hunter for hours, that the transition had happened so slowly and so smoothly that she had not even noticed it. And the greatest predator the Virathi Dominion had ever produced had been turned into prey by a bleeding, broken human with a sharpened mining pick. And he was still coming. The mine complex had been abandoned for 6 years, according to the colony records Sirath had intercepted, and the tunnels ran deep into the guts of Ket 7 like the veins of some enormous dead animal. And the darkness inside was absolute, the kind of darkness that had weight and texture and seemed to press against the skin. And Sirath should have had every advantage in there, because her species could see in total darkness, and the human could not. She entered the mine because she had no choice, because the human had herded her here, and going around would cost time and energy she could not afford to spend, and because some part of her, the part that was still the Neshvora, still the greatest hunter her people had ever produced, believed that close quarters and darkness would favor her and allow her to end this. She was wrong. The first sign that something was different came 30 meters inside the main tunnel, when her foot caught a wire stretched across the passage at ankle height, and a cascade of loose rock fell from a carefully weakened section of the ceiling and forced her to dive sideways into a side tunnel. And the rockfall sealed the main passage behind her, and channeled her deeper into the mine, along a route she had not chosen. He had been here before her. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, and she understood that while she had been resting and healing and accessing her ship's archive, the human had not been resting at all. He had been in these tunnels, preparing them, turning the abandoned mine into something that was not a shelter, and not a hiding place, but a weapon. The second trap was chemical, a container of mining solvent cracked open and left in a narrow passage, where the fumes concentrated in the still air. And Sirath's enhanced senses worked against her, because she could smell the solvent 100 times more intensely than a human would have. And the fumes burned her eyes and her breathing. Membranes, and she staggered sideways through a doorway into what had been a storage room. The third trap was sound, a piece of metal hung from a wire that she brushed against in the dark, and it rang out in the silence of the mine like a bell, announcing her position to anything that was listening. He was using her advantages against her, her superior senses, her speed in tight spaces, her tendency to move toward open ground when threatened, and he was channeling her, guiding her through the mine the way a river guides water, letting the terrain do the work his broken body could not. Sirath had hunted 300 sentient beings, and none of them had ever done anything like this. Because what Eli Morrow was doing was not the behavior of prey, it was not the behavior of a survivor, it was the behavior of a predator, so far beyond desperation that it had come out the other side into something cold and calculated and terrifying. She found him in a large chamber, deep in the mine, a room where the miners had once extracted ore from the walls, and the ceiling was high enough that she could stand at her full height. And he was there, standing in the center of the room, leaning on his mining pick like a crutch. And he looked like death itself had tried to claim him, and he had told death to wait. She attacked, because she was Virathi, and the Virathi did not hesitate, and she crossed the chamber in 2 strides and brought both bone blades down in a killing arc, and the ceiling above her exploded. He had weakened the supports, and the blast charge he triggered brought a ton of rock and metal down on top of her. And the world became noise and pressure and pain, and she felt her chitin crack in 3 places, and her left arm go numb, and the weight of the stone press her flat against the ground. Darkness. Real darkness. Not the darkness of the mind, but the darkness of unconsciousness, flickered at the edges of her vision, and she fought it back, because the Veyrathi did not surrender to darkness. And she lay there under the rubble and listened, and heard nothing, and thought for one moment that perhaps the human had been caught in his own trap. Then she heard breathing, ragged and wet and wrong, the sound of lungs that were not working the way lungs should work, and she forced the rubble off her body with the raw, desperate strength of a predator that would not allow itself to be buried. And she stood in the ruined chamber and looked for him. He was under the rocks on the far side of the room, and she could see one arm and part of his head, and he was not moving, and she thought it was over. Then the arm moved. His fingers dug into the stone and pulled, and his shoulder emerged, and then his head, covered in blood and dust and something that might have been a piece of his own torn scalp. And he coughed, and the cough was wet and red, and she could hear the whistle of a punctured lung in the sound, and he pulled himself free of the rubble, one agonizing inch at a time. He stood up. He should not have been able to stand up, and she knew this with the certainty of a hunter who had studied anatomy and biology and the breaking points of 100 species. And by every metric she had ever learned, this human should have been dead 3 times over. And yet he was standing, swaying like a tree in a storm, one eye swollen completely shut, blood running from his nose and his mouth, and a dozen wounds she had lost count of. And he was smiling. It was not a happy smile, and it was not a sane smile, and it was the smile of something that had gone so far past the point of breaking that it had found something on the other side, something that was beyond pain and beyond fear, and beyond the reasonable limits of what any living thing should be able to endure. Sirath struck, because she did not know what else to do, and her bone blade went through his chest, between the third and back axis, 4th rib, and she felt it slide through muscle, and scrape against bone, and puncture something soft and vital inside him. And it was a killing blow. She had made this exact strike 300 times, and nothing had ever survived it. Eli Morrow looked down at the blade buried in his chest, and then he looked up at her, and his one working eye was clear and focused and completely without fear. He grabbed the blade. His hand closed around the bone blade that was inside his own body, and he held it there, gripping it so tightly that she could not pull it free without tearing him apart even further. And his blood ran down the blade, and over his fingers and onto her arm. And with his other hand, the one holding the mining pick, he brought the sharpened edge up and drove it into the gap between the chitin plates at her neck. The pain was extraordinary, and Sirath screamed, and they fell together, tangled and bleeding and broken, and they hit the ground in a heap of chitin and torn flesh and dust. She pulled her blade free from his chest and rolled away, and the wound she left behind was terrible, a hole in his body that she could see things through that she should not have been able to see through. And he should have died right then, in that second, on that floor. He did not die. He pulled himself to a sitting position against the wall, and he tore strips from his own shirt and packed them into the wound in his chest, and he poured chemical powder from a mining kit over the packing, and the powder was meant for sealing cracks in rock, and it burned when it touched living tissue, and he made no sound at all while he did this. Sirath sat against the opposite wall, her hand pressed against the wound at her neck, her green bioluminescent blood pooling on the stone beneath her, and she looked at this creature, this soft, small, fragile, impossible creature, and she asked him the only question that mattered. She spoke in his language, in the common tongue she had learned from monitoring the colony's transmissions, and her voice was rough and wet and damaged, and the words came out broken and imperfect. "Why won't you die?" He looked at her with his one eye, the eye that was somehow still sharp and clear and alive, in a face that belonged on a corpse, and he breathed in with a sound like tearing paper, and he said 5 words, "I have people up there." He tilted his head toward the ceiling, toward the surface, toward the colony, where 43 humans lived and worked and slept, and had no idea that their sergeant was sitting in a hole in the ground, with a blade wound through his chest, keeping a monster at bay. "They need me to come back," he said, and his voice was quiet and steady and absolutely certain, "so I am not allowed to die." Scyrath stared at him, and she felt the doubt that had been growing since the first night of the hunt transform into something else entirely. Species had a word for, but never used. Something reserved for the old stories about the first hunts when the galaxy was young and the prey was worthy. She did not attack him again. She sat against her wall, and he sat against his, and they bled together in the dark. And for the first time in her life, Cyrith Kale chose not to kill something she could have killed. And the reason was not mercy, and it was not weakness. It was respect. They sat in the dark for a long time, and neither of them spoke, and the only sounds were the drip of blood on stone and the broken whistle of Eli's punctured lung, and the slow grinding of Cyrith's chitin plates as her body tried to heal itself. She watched him across the chamber, and he watched her, and there was no hostility in the watching, not anymore. And what existed between them now was something neither of them had words for, a silence that was not empty, but full of everything that had happened in the last 2 days, full of blood and pain and a kind of understanding that could only be earned by trying to kill each other and failing. Cyrith's healing factor was working, slowly sealing the wound at her neck, knitting the cracked plates along her torso back together, and she could feel her strength returning in small increments, and she knew that in a few more hours she would be functional enough to fight again. Again. The human was worse off than she was, and she could see this clearly even in the darkness of the mine, because her eyes did not need light, and he was sitting in a pool of his own blood that was growing slowly larger, and his breathing was getting worse, not better, and the improvised packing in his chest wound was soaked through, and the chemical sealant was cracking at the edges, and his skin had gone from pale to gray, which even her limited knowledge of human biology told her was very bad. He was dying, probably, or at least he was closer to dying than any living thing she had ever seen that was still conscious and still sitting upright, and still watching her with that steady, unbroken gaze. "Your species," she said, and the words came slowly because his language was strange to her, full of soft sounds and subtle meanings. "What are you made of?" He almost laughed, and the laugh turned into a cough that brought blood to his lips, and he wiped it away with the back of his hand, and said, "Same stuff as everything else, mostly water." She did not understand the humor, but she understood that he was making humor, while sitting in a pool of his own blood with a hole in his chest. And this told her something about humans that no xenobiology file ever could. "I have killed 300, she said. 19 species, many of them stronger than you, faster, harder to break, and none of them did what you have done." "What did I do?" he asked. "You refused," she said, and the word felt inadequate in his language, too small for what she meant. "Everything about your body says you should be dead, and you refused, and I do not understand how. I do not understand what part of you is doing the refusing, because it is not your muscles, and it is not your bones, and it is not your blood. Those are all failing, so what is left?" He was quiet for a moment, and she could hear him thinking in the way his breathing changed, steadying, a small gathering of focus, and then he said something that she would remember for the rest of her life. "Where I come from, we have a word for it. We call it stubbornness. But that is not really right either. It is more like a decision. You decide you are not going to die, and then your body has to listen, because your body works for you, not the other way around." "That is not how biology works," Cyrith said. "No," he agreed, "it is not, and yet here I am." And there he was. Dawn came again, the third dawn since the hunt had begun, and the light crept into the mine through cracks and shafts and the distant entrance. And Sirath rose and tested her body and found it functional, not fully healed, but capable. And she was strong enough now to finish this, to make the killing strike on a human who could barely lift his head. She walked to the entrance of the chamber and looked down the long tunnel toward the surface, and the red light of morning painted the stone walls in shades of rust and copper, and she stood there for a long time. Then she turned back to look at Eli Morrow, and he was watching her, and he had somehow gotten to his feet, leaning against the mine wall, with one hand pressed against his chest, and the other holding that stupid, crude mining pick that had caused her more pain than any weapon in her hunting career. And he was standing in the entrance to the tunnel that led deeper into the mine, blocking her path to nowhere, guarding nothing. Because that was what he did. He stood between danger and the things he cared about, and he did not move. She made a decision that no Veyrathi huntress had made in over 6,000 years. She lowered her bone blades and pressed her clawed hand flat against her chest, over the place where the Veyrathi kept the organ they used for pumping blood, and she spoke a word in her own language, a word that sounded like stones grinding together and wind moving through a canyon. And the word was Kel Sirath. It was the rite of naming, and it was the oldest ritual her people possessed, older than the Dominion itself, and it was reserved for prey that had proven itself not prey but equal, not a thing to be hunted, but a thing to be honored, and the last time it had been performed was 6,000 years ago, on a world that no longer existed, for a species that had since gone extinct. She looked at Eli, and she said in his language, "You are not prey, you were never prey, and I name you Neshvor, which means hunter, which means equal, which means the thing I will not kill, because killing it would make the universe smaller." He stared at her, and she could not read human expressions well, but she thought what she saw on his face might have been surprise, and then something softer, something tired and grateful and sad all at the same time. She walked past him toward the mine entrance, and he did not try to stop her, because whatever had been between them, the hunt, the violence, the desperate struggle for survival, it was over, and they both knew it. She emerged into the morning light and climbed the ridge to where her ship was waiting, cloaked and silent above the colony. And she sat in the pilot's seat and opened the Dominion Xenobiology archive and deleted the existing entry on humans and wrote a new one. She wrote it carefully, choosing each word with the same precision she used when choosing where to place a killing strike. Because these words mattered more than any strike she had ever made. Species, human, she wrote. Homeworld, Earth. Classification, Class 12 Death World. Physical threat, moderate at best. Regenerative capacity, insufficient. Speed, inferior to most galactic species. Strength, inferior to most galactic species. Natural weapons, none. Natural armor, none. The part that mattered. Threat classification, do not hunt. They do not stop, she wrote. They do not yield. Pain does not deter them, and injury does not slow them, and death does not frighten them. They are not the fastest, or the strongest, or the most armored species in the galaxy. They are the ones that will not allow themselves to die, and that makes them the most dangerous thing alive. I was the greatest huntress the Dominion has ever produced, she wrote. I held the title of Neshvora for 11 years, and I killed 300 sentient beings across 19 species, and I had never failed. I have failed. Reclassify humans immediately, she wrote. Remove them from the prey registry, and do not put them back. They are not prey. They were never prey. And any huntress who goes after them will learn the same lesson I learned, which is that there is nothing in this galaxy more terrifying than a soft, small, fragile creature that has decided it is not going to die. She saved the entry and closed the archive and lifted her ship out of the atmosphere of Ket 7 and did not look back. Eli Morrow watched the ship leave from the mouth of the mine, a faint shimmer of light moving upward through the red sky, and the moment it cleared the atmosphere, his legs gave out, and he collapsed face first into the dust, and did not get up. The colony found him 4 hours later, lying in his own blood, in front of an abandoned mine entrance. And they rushed him into the medical bay, and put him in a recovery pod, and spent 3 weeks piecing him back together. And when he finally woke up, the colony governor was standing beside his bed, with a look on her face that was somewhere between amazement and terror. "There is a Veyrathi diplomatic vessel in orbit," she said, and the words sounded like she did not fully believe them even as she spoke them. "The first one in recorded history, and they are requesting a formal meeting with our species." Eli blinked and sat up slowly, and felt the scar on his chest where the bone blade had gone through. Ridge of new skin over old damage. And he asked, "What do they want?" The governor shook her head, like someone trying to wake up from a dream, and said, "They want an alliance. Apparently they would rather have us beside them than against us. And they specifically asked to speak to you. They called you a word I could not translate, but the closest meaning seems to be equal." Eli looked at the ceiling of the medical bay for a long time, and then he looked at the governor, and then he looked at his own hands, scarred and healing, and still strong enough to grip, and he said nothing. He did not need to say anything. He had already said everything that mattered, in a dark mine on a dead moon, with a blade through his chest and a monster across the room. He had said he was not allowed to die.